You're listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. In each episode, our experts will provide you with the where, how, and when to make decisions that transform your business.
My name is Kristen Hallam, and we are digging into our big themes for 2024. The global environment has still not settled onto a clear pathway toward a new stability. As we enter 2024 in this disjointed world, we confront risks posed by potential volatility across the economic and political spheres. We also see potential opportunities arising from the new reality of greatly segmented global relationships. To discuss these themes, we are joined by the following analysts from S&P Global Market Intelligence: Natznet Tesfay, Head of Insights and Analysis; Ken Wattret, Global Economist; Laurence Allan, Head of Europe Insights and Analysis; and Eric Johnson, Senior Technology Editor at the Journal of Commerce, part of S&P Global. It's time for the big reveal. Natznet, what are the 5 themes that our Insights and Analysis team will be tracking in 2024?
Our team has identified 5 overlapping themes that will influence each other. And these are geopolitical reordering, economic fault lines, resource security, supply chain resilience, and logistics rewired. When we highlight geopolitical reordering, we note the world is expected to see 78 elections over the next year, and just over half of these will be presidential polls. We are helping our clients anticipate what the preparations for these votes and the outcomes of them will likely mean for policy direction and priorities. So we start to see how this intersects with the economic fault lines that we have identified, like regional divergence and economic prospects and conditions. Similarly, it's the case for resource security, as we see countries are hedging amidst geopolitical reordering and deciding whom they want to compete with or where they'd like to cooperate. And this, of course, has already started to shape trade and industrial policies, as we see the relationships between major economies remains contentious, and emerging markets are seeking to create their own space in the global environment for their national interests. Finally, we bring this to unpack it towards the supply chain resilience and logistics rewired, as our clients and businesses are trying to navigate the associated costs and physical challenges. So it's really comprehensive in identifying each of these themes and how they interplay or connect with each other.
And Natznet, how did the team arrive at these themes for 2024?
We have a truly global team, and it's really a multidisciplinary group. So we have expert groups in macroeconomics, industry, supply chain, and country risk. And the practice leads are constantly collaborating because we need to surface the interdependencies and connections between the issues the respective groups are tracking. But that type of model, we can more organically surface what are going to be the key pivot points over the coming year, as we're all forecasting outlooks for our respective clients, and helping to then anticipate what is likely to be the outcomes and quantifying this, at times teasing them out in multiple potential scenarios, as well as trying to identify what the core impact areas are so our clients can mitigate those risks and also be positioned to leverage the opportunities.
Let's delve a little deeper into these 2024 themes now, starting with economic fault lines. Ken, we're seeing a rather large fault line developing between the US and Western Europe, with Q3 growth of over 5% in the US and near recessionary conditions in Western Europe. Have we ever seen that level of divergence before?
It's fair to say that's pretty unusual. Bear in mind, in the last 5 quarters, we've had the US economy growing above its potential rate, while in Western Europe, most economies have either been flatlining or in some cases even contracting. There have been prior instances of divergence. 2012, for example, springs to mind. Back then, the euro area was in recession amid a multifaceted financial crisis. One could argue an existential crisis, actually, while the US economy that year recorded annual growth of over 2%. So we have seen it happen periodically, but typically these periods of acute divergence are rare, and they normally reflect a shock on one side or another. We've had Western European economies hit relatively hard by the after effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including obviously disruption to energy supplies, higher prices, and so on. What's interesting about contrasting growth performance presently is that central banks in both the US and across Western Europe, they've been tightening monetary policy unusually rapidly over the past year and a half. And given that common shock, one would have expected both to have experienced much weaker growth simultaneously, and that hasn't been happening. Now, it may not be happening yet, but we need to be careful how we interpret some of the news that we're getting from the US economy, including looking at the details of that super strong third quarter GDP print. First of all, it reflects some temporary factors, including particularly a very large contribution from inventories. And secondly, key thing, not just for the US, but also elsewhere, the full effects of the ongoing tightening of financial conditions on economic activity are yet to be felt. And both of those points taken together suggest that over the coming quarters, US growth is very likely to weaken.
What other fault lines are we seeing in the global economy, Ken?
Well, there are plenty of them. Another unusual development that we've seen recently is central banks in some emerging economies already cutting their policy rate, while the Federal Reserve in the US is still in tightening mode. In parts of Latin America and emerging Europe, these monetary easing cycles, they're well underway. We've seen multiple rate cuts, in some cases, some quite large reductions in policy rates. And we're expecting that trend to go significantly further, and also for those rate cuts in emerging economies to become more widespread in the early part of 2024. In contrast, we think that easing cycles in the US and other advanced economies will probably only begin from the middle of 2024 onwards, given lingering inflation concerns. One consequence of this unusual monetary policy divergence has been strength of the US dollar. We also expect that that will reverse once the US interest rate cycle turns. We may already be seeing some signs that the peak of the dollar is behind us, but we really need to see signs of a monetary policy pivot from hiking to easing before we see a substantial decline in the US currency.
It sounds like inflation has been tamed in some economies, but not all. What's it going to take to get global inflation under control, Ken?
The rate cuts that we've just been talking about in some emerging economies, their central banks reacted much more quickly and substantively to the sharp pickup in inflation rates that we saw from 2021. And there, in general, we've seen inflationary pressures receding earlier. In the US and Europe, the policy responses, they came much later on, and we're yet to see their full effects, as mentioned. And long story short, in order to bring inflation down to where central banks in advanced economies would want it to be, around 2% or so, in a sustainable way, we think that requires a period of sustained below potential growth. We're already seeing that in Europe. We're yet to see that in the US, but we do expect to see it if, as we believe, the Fed is committed to bringing US inflation back to target. And I think the way I would think about this is, one way or another, financial conditions will need to be sufficiently restricted. If it's not via sufficiently high levels of bond yields, long-term interest rates, or through currency strength, then it's likely to be the result of higher policy rates.
And if the US economy slows, or maybe I should say when that happens, will we see a global recession?
We see that more as a risk scenario rather than a base case, and there are various reasons why. Partly it's because we don't see the same degree of imbalances and excesses building up in the global economy that we've seen prior to widespread recessions in the past, particularly the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. There was a huge buildup of excesses and imbalances beforehand. There are some vulnerabilities currently, but they're much less widespread and extreme. There are also some differences depending on the regions that we're looking at. Thinking about Asia Pacific, for example, monetary policy tightening there has been less pronounced because the worries about underlying price pressures have been much less marked. And so those economies are, in general, looking better set for domestic demand to continue at a reasonable clip, and that should help provide a cushion for the global economy against recession. We still need to keep a close eye on the possible downside risks, and again, there are plenty of them. That could be an increase in financial sector stress. It could be geopolitical shocks. The base case is we won't have a hard landing for the global economy. We'll see weaker growth in the US, and that will have spillover effects elsewhere. But we do need to keep a very close eye on some of those downside risks.
A global economic slowdown would certainly impact trade and supply chains, which have already seen seismic changes in demand and trade tensions following the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. In response, some companies are reshoring or diversifying their supply chains to build resilience to future shocks. Eric, how is this likely to impact transportation networks?
I'd start off by saying there is never any free lunch, right? You can't build a more resilient supply chain without some added cost or complexity or both. So if you view resiliency as increasing your sourcing locations or increasing your network of service partners, the transportation capacity providers have to figure out how to serve you with those new needs, whether it's new locations or deeper supply chains within existing sourcing locations. So we have absolutely seen a shift from China specifically to sourcing locations in Southeast Asia, to India, to LATAM, and in the case of North America, a huge shift to cross-border trade out of Mexico. That is happening, and it will continue to happen. But it's not as though these new regions, these sort of diversified or plus one regions, are replacing China. Rather, they're augmenting the choices. And so, again, this comes back to the issue of how much complexity a company wants to manage when they're thinking about resiliency. And I think there was a sort of false narrative that people in charge of global supply chains during the pandemic collectively made a conscious decision to go from just in time to just in case, when in reality, every company is constantly managing a balance between those two, no matter how much demand there was and how congested ports around the world were and how tight capacity on vessels and airplanes and trucks were. The sky was not the limit, right? You needed to manage your cost and balance that against actually getting product to market. But if the geopolitical conditions or climate regulations or just internal compliance is mandating more diversity in sourcing locations or supplier networks, that is going to be additional complexity to manage going into 2024, and you have to account for that. And as a result, all the service providers that corporates depend on have to adjust as well. Basically, in a neat phrase, I'd say that the transportation world and logistics world is not as binary as it was just a few years ago.
And what are the risks associated with that greater level of complexity that you just talked about?
There's a lot, and probably too numerous to go through in our discussion today, but just to highlight a few. When you expand the list of partners, you expand the list of suppliers you use, you expand the list of governments that you have to interface with, that is administrative burden, that is cost burden, no matter how intriguing the opportunity or no matter how good it looks on paper to diversify away from being overly reliant on a single supplier or a single sourcing location. And more complexity means you're exposed to more potential vectors. So that can expose you to things like sanctions risks, right? We have multiple conflicts going on at this moment with who knows how many more to come in 2024 that are unforeseen at this moment. And so sanctions are likely to expand beyond the nations that have long been part of denied entity lists to places where sanctions are starting to be applied if the world and the agencies that sort of bind the world together on these things decide that one of those countries has made an egregious error, right? So having less eggs in one basket is good in one sense, but it exposes you to new complications. And from a commercial standpoint, it also diminishes customer leverage over any single commercial partner, right? If you have a deep relationship with a partner in a specific region and you have to expand beyond that, you're sort of minimizing your leverage that you had previously.
And Eric, what challenges to logistics networks are emerging that we haven't seen before?
We've seen pretty much everything under the sun over the last few years. It seems like there's a never-ending pipeline of new disruptions to manage. So one thing I think about is whether there are legitimately more disruptions in play now, or whether we just have more data and transparency in real time about these disruptions that we didn't have in previous years or generations, right? So if you ascribe to the view that it's the former, that we actually do have more disruptions and it's not just that we're more aware of them, then it's really about managing, again, that balance of cost versus resilience in a world that is requiring a lot of management of exceptions because the exceptions are becoming the rule. And then in terms of things on the horizon, one thing I'll highlight that the shipping industry is dealing with right now is a tremendous amount of uncertainty around reducing carbon emissions, how to achieve it, how to measure it, and indeed which fuel or fuels, more likely fuels, will power the next generation of shipping. And there's a sense that someone has to bear the costs of switching to greener fuel rather than it being a cost that sits outside of a commercial relationship. It's likely that these costs will be absorbed by service providers when the market is loose and by cargo owners, the companies running their global supply chains, when the market is tight. So it's going to be really market driven rather than a cost that everyone agrees needs to be borne by a certain entity, no matter what the shape of the supply demand picture is.
Supply chains have become an integral part of national security strategies as the world faces common challenges like climate change and the energy transition. We see competition among countries for resources ranging from water and food to critical minerals. Laurence, how do we expect this strategic competition to manifest itself in 2024?
Probably the first overarching point, which will be no surprise perhaps to anyone, is that the strategic competition between the US and mainland China is still going to be the major framing for that. And pretty much everyone else, including the EU, including India, are hedging between these two markets to deepen trade links, to source capital, to influence in multilateral forums. Having said that, while the US and China will maintain this kind of really outsized influence globally, the actions of emerging economies are something that we're very focused on and which will become more critical this year. So within that context, developing economies, particularly in Asia Pacific, are going to continue to drive global economic growth in 2024. And these economies will seek to leverage that economic influence, that economic clout into extended, more far-reaching geopolitical influence, both in bilateral relations and in multilateral relations. So for example, in the MENA region, the Arab Gulf states will be driving economic growth, including governments like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and they'll be aiming to balance their political and security ties between mainland China and the US. And in multilateral forums, they'll be looking to move beyond their traditional exercise of influence over setting global energy prices into other areas of global influence. Having said that, for that region at least, because of the long-running security challenges, of course, such as Israel-Gaza and the strategic need to secure key infrastructure routes like the Suez Canal, like the Straits of Hormuz, that region is almost certainly still going to see the US remain as the main external security presence. If we just focus briefly on natural resources, of course, key. We think that many governments in resource-rich producer countries, notably in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, will be able to at least aspirationally try to exploit the opportunities that exist by leveraging this increased global competition, of course, increasingly driven by energy transition strategies. And they'll seek to do that by trying to get greater national economic and industrial development strategies into place as a consequence of that competition for natural resources. There will be quite diverse approaches. There's quite a lot of diversity, both the two regions that I mentioned, both within those regions and between them. But for example, we're likely to see in mining quite a lot of redefinition or reviewing of mining codes and mining laws as demand grows, as producer countries are seeking to capture more of that. So they'll be requiring private firms to partner with the state. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but of course it exposes more people to, for example, higher probability of contract revisions, of cancellations. We also think we're going to see a variety of different measures from a menu, including production quotas, export bans, local content provisions, and tightened environmental requirements through 2024. And just one last point on that, as we don't think that the Ukraine-Russia conflict is going to come to a conclusion in 2024, the sanctions regime is going to remain wide and intense and probably intensify through the year. And so that also is going to remain a key factor for global politics and global business and investment through 2024.
Now, as Natznet mentioned, there are numerous elections scheduled for 2024. Laurence, what elections do you think are the most consequential or the most worth watching next year?
Well, of course, Kristen, all elections are consequential for the local electorates, right? And for investment strategies and operational strategies in those geographies. And we'll be looking at 2 billion people voting in democratic elections next year. We'll be tracking these very closely for that very reason. Of course, and as ever, if I'm talking about this from a global perspective, the US elections are the single most highly consequential for the rest of the world. There are others of consequence, of course, taking place. Let me just flag 3 or 4 for different reasons. So the first of which is India, of course, which is the largest democracy anywhere, which does have very vibrant economic growth projected over the next 4 or 5 years. In terms of the way that the elections are going to impact its current strategy and the way it positions itself in the world is really going to be a function of whether current Prime Minister Modi gets a majority, whether the opposition gets a majority, or whether we're left with a coalition government of some sort in India, which would to some extent moderate some of the strategy that India has been following under Modi. But elsewhere, similarly significantly, in Mexico, we have presidential elections after 6 years of the current government. Of course, Mexico, a key jurisdiction for a lot of reshoring, as Eric's already signaled. So a very key election. We don't assess any major change in terms of the general alignment with the US. So irrespective of the election outcome, we're still going to see a Mexico that's pretty aligned with the US. But in terms of Mexican actions elsewhere, we'll be looking at especially Mexico-US conversations around migration and drug trafficking to indicate how the new Mexican government might hedge its bets with other actors. There are also EU Parliament elections, pretty unexciting for the most part for everyone except those of us who follow the EU closely, but important. We're going to get a new commission this year. What we don't see are any consistent indicators that these elections or the reformation of the commission is going to radically shift EU position on some of the really big ticket issues, such as, for example, its position on the Ukraine war. Outside of those big ones, I think one interesting one just to keep one eye on is the constitutional referendum in Chile, which has been hugely contentious internally. This is to try and replace the Pinochet-era constitution. The current left-of-centre government has now put forward a couple of different versions. It's going to be voted on in December. It's unlikely to shift the business environment in a profound way. Chile's still going to be pretty business-friendly and investment-friendly. But one way or another out of this, over the next 12 months, we're likely to see a pretty significant tightening of environmental oversight for especially big mining projects. And of course, that's important because Chile is not only a very significant copper producer, but has quite significant rare earth minerals deposits as well. So that's one that we're going to be watching carefully to see how that plays out as we think about not just political stability, but about energy transition, critical minerals, and this competition for resources.
Now, I heard a few nuggets related to climate change in our discussion. Natsa, how does climate change cut across our 5 themes for 2024?
You'll see how it is baked into most of our themes and to our ongoing coverage across the board. For example, if I were to take supply chain resilience, we've seen over the last year how extreme weather events like the heat wave in North America and Europe had an impact on labor productivity and availability for essential sectors. So we give note to that as we anticipate potential impacts in the year coming. Similarly, when we look at resource security, we note that there's the El Nino phenomenon, which could be potentially severe over the coming year, and the more obvious impact on agricultural production in an environment where we've already seen export restrictions around rice or palm oil over the past year. When it comes to severe flooding and drought, we highlight how it impacts different sectors, maybe more obviously industries and regions reliant on hydropower like mining or cooling, so data centers, etc. My colleagues can go into how it affects logistics and other areas as we've seen over the course of the past year.
Eric, would you like to talk about logistics?
Sure. So I think top issue of the day right now as it relates to climate impacts on shipping is what's going on in the Panama Canal. I'm not a climatologist, but as I understand it, we are now entering the dry season in Panama, so we shouldn't be expecting any more rainfall into the lake that the locks feed into. The Panama Canal Authority has issued guidance that they are going to be restricting the number of vessels that can transit across the locks. That is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of impacts on logistics networks and shipping. We certainly have seen inland waterways, both in Europe and the US impacted by low water levels over the last couple of years. I don't think anyone is forecasting that will drastically change those types of disruptions over the next couple of years. That can obviously flip to flooding when there's an excess amount of water in those regions, right? And then I think Natznet referenced it earlier, extreme weather conditions are having an impact on port operations. We're seeing more days with ports in Asia being affected by typhoons and super typhoons and cyclones in India. This is becoming, instead of a sporadic disruption to manage, it's becoming something that virtually every port and then all the users of those ports are having to think about and bake into contingency planning when they look at the year ahead and especially what ports they're using.
Natznet, where have we incorporated labor as a key factor for 2024?
Rather than focusing on it exclusively, we've looked at it as part of supply chain, as labor costs as a driver, as companies and different stakeholders look at where they need to base production. We've seen some cooling in the labor market. We've seen some softening in job vacancy rates, and this is partly due to the slowdown in economic growth in some key areas and easing of inflation, as Ken has already highlighted. But we still see vacancy rates at higher than pre-pandemic levels, and strong demands are likely to continue with organized labor. So there have been questions as to whether or not we're going to see upward pressure on wages in the US, and we think this is likely because agreements that were put in place before inflation peaked are coming up for renewal. We see unions and workers keen to recoup losses in real wages in that period to insert certain benefits or conditions such as cost of living adjustments on an ongoing basis. And we're likely to see this particularly emboldened in the manufacturing sector after what is seen as to be a successful 6-week strike targeting 3 major auto manufacturers in the US recently. So those pressures are likely to continue, but not just in the US, also parts of Europe, so looking at places like Germany and some APAC markets. I would note the potential for politicization of these strikes. So on a smaller scale, we see garment worker strikes in a country like Bangladesh coinciding with some opposition protests and how that can start to amplify the impact of that.
That's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Natznet, Ken, Laurence, and Eric for sharing their insights with us. And thanks to you for listening. We're committed to continuing the conversation on our key themes for 2024. Look for more thematic coverage in our Connect platform for clients and on our blog. That includes our top 10 economic predictions for 2024 coming soon to our blog and our podcast. Please note we'll be taking a break for the holiday season, and the podcast will return on January 6th. Happy holidays!
Thank you for listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.